Hi guys, I'm Sarah, and this is episode 6 of my barn quilt project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. I found this week's block just outside of Gravenhurst, on the Ryde Centennial Free Methodist Church. This block is a part of the Ryde Barn Quilt Trail, which was created to commemorate 135 years of settlement in Ryde Township. They have a website that I'll link down below that has a map of all of the quilt blocks in the area, as well as info about the history of the buildings the blocks are placed on. For example, the church featuring this week's block was built in 1977 to replace the 1892 church across the street, which was no longer large enough to meet the needs of the community. This block is known as the Heavenly Stars, definitely a block fitting for a church, and I have chosen to keep my construction simple and sew it up using only squares and half-square triangles. To make all the points I need for the stars, I need 32 half-square triangles. So my usual method of making 2 at a time wasn't going to cut it. So instead I decided to try a new method of making 8 at a time. This block has a very basic color scheme, using only 2 colors, yellow and blue. The blue fabric I had left over from a dress that I sewed for myself a few years back, and the yellow I recently thrifted in a mixed bag of quilting fabric from Value Village. I really like having only 2 colors to work with after sewing so many colorful blocks in a row. The 2 colors are much less busy and feel very classic and timeless. My cutting wheel definitely got a workout with this one. As just a start, even before sewing and cutting apart my half-square triangles, I am cutting out 40 separate pieces. For my solid colored squares, I cut out 16 2-inch blue squares and 16 2-inch yellow squares. To make my 8 at a time half-square triangles, I cut out 4 5¼ inch squares of the blue and 4 5¼ inch squares of the yellow. These will be used to sew up 32 half-square triangles. Once all of that initial cutting work was done, I put my 2-inch squares off to the side and started work sewing up my many half-square triangles. I started by pinning 1 5¼ inch blue square right sides together with a 5¼ inch yellow square. I used the pencil to draw a guideline diagonally across the square in both directions, forming an X. I used these lines to guide my sewing and sew 1/4 inch from either side of each guideline. Just pretend you don't see that finished section of the block in the corner there. I may not film all of my videos in chronological order. Does make for a fun little sneak preview though. Anyways, once those lines of stitching were done, I took the piece over to my cutting mat to cut apart my half-square triangles. I first cut the square in half, making sure to cut directly through the center of the X. Then I cut each of those halves in half again, cutting directly through where the guidelines intersect. Then I had 4 squares, and I cut directly down the drawn guideline to separate each square into 2 half-square triangles. I repeated that process 3 more times with my remaining 5¼ inch square to create all 32 of the half-square triangles I needed. I pressed each of those half-square triangles open, pressing the seam towards the blue. I made my half-square triangles a little bigger than they needed to be, so I had to trim them down to an even 2 inches. Trimming all 32 was definitely the most tedious and time-consuming part of this block, but I made sure to take care to keep my corners properly placed with the 45-degree color split, so that my points will all line up in the final block. Next week's block is going to be a lot less technical than this one, but a very fun design. Subscribe so you don't miss it. After what felt like forever, all of my half-square triangles were ready to go, and it was time to start assembling the block. I decided to divide the block into 4 parts, which I would then sew together in order to minimize the number of seams I needed to match in each step. I used my previously cut squares and half-square triangles to lay out the design for the first quarter. I pinned each row of the design together, double-checking as I went that each piece was positioned in the correct orientation. I was then able to head over to the sewing machine to sew up each of those seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I sewed these together in a chain, butting each row up against the last as I sewed, so that I didn't have to raise the foot and cut the thread between pieces, and instead was just able to cut the threads connecting the rows once they were all sewn. This saved me both time and thread, which is great because the less times I have to refill the bobbin during a project, the better. Once the seams were all sewn up, I had to press them, and as I did this, I paid close attention to how the pieces would fit together in the next step. I made sure to press the seams in such a way that when the pieces are sewn together, the seams will nest together nicely. That means for each piece, pressing the seams in the opposite direction as the row above it. This takes a little extra time, but is definitely worth it, and makes getting those crisp corners a lot easier. Next, I pinned together the top 2 rows and the bottom 2 rows. I made sure to line up all of the corners and to nest those seams together that I had just pressed. I took the rows back over to the machine and sewed up those seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As I sewed, I kept checking in on the seams on the underside of the project to make sure that they stayed laying in the position I wanted them in as I sewed them in place. If one of those seams decided to fold back on itself, I just tucked it back into place with a flat scraper tool. I got those seams all sewn up and then took the pieces over to the ironing board and pressed those seams flat. With those pressed, it was time to finish up the block quarter, so I lined up my 2 halves and pinned them right sides together. I made sure again to line up all of my corners and nest my seams. I sewed that seam up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance as always, and my points and corners were looking pretty good. I gave my piece a press to get everything laying flat, and then completed the entire assembly process 3 more times. Once all 4 quarters were sewn, I was able to lay them out and get my first look at the final block. I started assembling it by pinning together the top 2 pieces and the bottom 2 pieces, being sure to match up all the corners and nest the seams together. At this point, everything was lining up really well and looking fantastic, so I was extra careful because I didn't want to mess it all up at the very end. I sewed the seams up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then gave the pieces a press. After that, the block was almost done, and there was only 1 seam left to sew up. I pinned those last 2 pieces together, and this seam had the most corners to match and seams to nest, so the pressure was on. I'm really impressed with myself and how well everything in this block lines up, especially considering how many pieces are involved. This might be my best block yet, technically speaking. Next week, I might be doing a less technical block, but it's on an egg farm, and they really leaned into that when designing their barn quilt, so it's gonna be a fun one. Anyways, I sewed up that last seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it was pretty much finished and just needed a final press and a trim. As I already said, I am really happy with how this one turned out, and I love the color combination. Despite this block having a lot of pieces to assemble, this design is one I could totally see myself making an entire quilt out of. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's Heavenly Stars block as much as I did. And if you did, like and subscribe for more. As always, happy quilting.